The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast. Today's an interesting episode for you. Today's episode is in response to episode 53, where you guys may remember, or maybe not, that we had Javid on, and we talked about DMX and emergency and all sorts of fun stuff. UL 924, we're going to dive into that a little bit more. As we tried to get into it, turns out we got a little bit deeper than we had planned on during the entire thing. And so we had some responses and some questions back from some of our viewers. So we're having Javid back on with a special guest to sort of help clear things up a little bit. Before we jump into the conversation, let me just take a minute to remind everyone today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We've got all of our episodes, a news feed, merch store, trainings, as well as our council on lighting control startup and integration. If you want to get involved or you know somebody who might be a good member for that council, please reach out to us. We're always looking for help on that, and we really want to make sure that we're providing great resources for the industry. But until then, let's get into this. So Javid, you and Mitch Hefter here, you guys kind of came to us and said that we had some missteps in communication. I wouldn't say we were necessarily incorrect. I mean, I'll own it if I'm wrong about something. I'll tell me I'm wrong about something. But Javid, why don't we start with you? You had some interesting things to talk about regarding protocols.
Thanks. Really appreciate the chance to come back and talk a little bit more about a couple of topics that, in trying to avoid getting down into the weeds, we wound up getting down into the weeds. And so good to clarify a couple of things. I'd wanted to start off because the episode told about being a signal in a protocol. So I just wanted to note that signal and protocol are different things. For those of the listeners that are not familiar with the OSI 7-layer model, there's a whole series of different application layers that are generally defined. And that lowest layer, layer 1, is generally considered the physical layer. And layer 2 is the protocol layer. And I think last time we went back and forth a little bit between the first layer and the second layer. That being said, there's really no signal and protocol out there that's entirely clean, where it's just layer 1 or just layer 2. There's always a little bit of fuzziness, particularly when you start talking about what's happening on the wire and how those voltages get converted into bits. So just understand that if you'd like to dive into it deeper, look up the 7-layer model, and there's some good resources online that will give you a lot more description there. DMF12 sits on the boundary of layer 1 and layer 2. The standard includes both a description of the electrical signals as well as the data format. So it's a little bit of both.
Right.
So clarify that.
Yeah. So I mean, just to package that, because I think that it's a really important distinction when people are dealing with the semantics of lighting controls. You know, we like to use the term protocol, but really, it's not specifically how we're dealing with protocols in IT or other industries. You know, the term really is just a generic category for the control being sent to the luminaire for the purposes of dimming or control of some kind directly with that luminaire.
Right. And sometimes it'll be called a method as well as a signal or protocol. And the key is it's the OSI model. Right. And very few protocols, whatever out there, adhere 100% to that model, but it makes it easy for the discussion, and it's a very useful tool when you have to get into that's a particular patch of weeds.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, once you start picking away at it, you start realizing the flaw in the term. but in our industry, we're pretty ubiquitous with it at this point.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. We just like to say protocol because it's very quick and clean and concise. But do appreciate that clarification, and that's the thing, is we like to be informative on this, and so we really appreciate you guys coming on and helping clarify all of these things, because there are definitely times where I'm sure people are listening to the podcast and are like, why did you say it that way, or what are you saying? But yeah, so on to the bigger topic here, which is more about emergency stuff. You guys had Mitch reached out to us originally and flagged, like, hey, you said you weren't gonna get into the weeds, but you kind of did get into the weeds, and so let's just try to find a way to really be nice and clear and concise about what it is that we are trying to convey about this.
Okay, I can start on that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that came out of the discussion in podcast 53 is some of the minor changes in E1.11 DMX512 that are coming out very soon. There was a discussion about the labeling would help distinguish what's going on if you've lost data or whatever. The thing is, it's not, the labeling itself is not required. You are required to declare it in the documentation what's going on. Labeling, and we say labeling should be done, but it's not required. So,
and specifically, this is a label that would go on the device or the product in question.
Right. And there was, discussion in particular regarding the loss of data in conjunction with UL 924 and National Electrical Code (NEC) requirements. And the changes in E1.11 and with the introduction of E1.68, which is the compliance standard, both of those are again coming out any day now. They may make it simpler to do your comply with the code requirements, but it's not automatic, and that's one thing you still have to do your homework. It's not like you can't just do the cliff notes. You got to do a little more in depth when you work on that topic.
And so just to help our listeners a little bit on that, what homework are you specifically referring to?
All right. Well, one of the things that got mentioned, which was not really accurate, was that 924 is new. There's new requirements. It's actually the 10th edition actually dates back to 2016, but there have been several revisions to it, and sometimes you have to go into the weeds on a UL document to figure out which version, because it still says edition 10.
Yeah.
But the last actual change was in December of 2022. So there's several key clauses in there, and what we were talking about primarily is it's called Clause 29A, and it talks about emergency lighting control devices and the different rules involved that. It also points to Clause 47, which, okay, you didn't want me to get into the weeds, but but
too late.
No, that has to do with the testing, and there's several other things. So all those are some key parts of this document, which is it's over 160 pages,
right?
That are used in the evaluation. Now this new labeling recommendation and the revision of the language talking about loss of data and actually what happens on boot up, because when you boot up your fixture, you power it up, those may be different behaviors, and we've got a simple classification system now that makes it easier to understand. It still could be expanded on documentation, but somebody familiar with it can go right to the document, and if there's a label, know what to expect. Now, some of this comes out because there's changes in the code itself. The whole concept of a directly controlled luminaire was actually introduced in the 2014 code, and that is.
And if I could jump in, I think that was where we may have gotten a little bit lost in the weeds in the previous episode. The changes in the electrical code are in 2023. Those are new, but there are no changes to UL 924. Those are existing. So I wanted to be very, very clear in that so that we understood what was confusing in the last episode.
Right. So, and when we introduced the concept of directly controlled luminaires in 2014, then there was some additional additions, clarifications, revision that have occurred in 2017, 2020, and 2023. And of course, now we're in the 2026 cycle, so there may be more changes coming, but we won't know that for a good year or so. So we're not going to even talk about what those might be. I think the key thing for a number of people, and particularly in the architectural lighting control industry, where the 10-volt protocol standard is prevalent, is that if you are basically disconnecting the signal, it will go to full if it has power. And that was, and if it does that, then you don't have to have the listing for the product that the previous editions of the code did call for. Now, if you're still using an active signal, like if you're using DMX512 to control your moving light or even your fixed light, and you're using the DMX512 to control its emergency mode, that luminaire still has to be listed. That's what we would call active control. That's still required. But if it's a disconnection, well, DMX512 hasn't defined its behavior, and that's one of the things we're trying to get to with this revision of DMX512. So if it's the disconnection mode is also used with Dolly. Those are the most common systems. There's also methods with wireless, which that's another patch of weeds we won't go to today. There's different approaches. Dolly is actually configurable, so some people might argue that disconnecting it may not meet this requirement in the 23 code, but it's been a common practice, and so that's not normally an issue people run into. But if you are sending a signal out to actively control your emergency luminaire, the code does require that luminaire be listed. If it works with this disconnect method, you've got a battery pack or inverter or whatever, that changes the discussion.
So to try to summarize what you said, and please step in if I misspeak, but if I have a 0 to 10 or a DMX512A luminaire, because those are technically actively controlled signals, once you snip the wires, that signal disappears and the luminaire doesn't know what to do in response to that because it's not getting an active control. It's like you take your foot off the gas pedal. Suddenly there's nothing telling the engine to do anything. And so in this case, cutting those wires is disconnecting the control from the luminaire. And as a result, if the default behavior as defined in the emergency requirement is go to an emergency level, then you do not have to have that listing, correct?
Well, if on it's the fixture.
On the fixture, yes.
Yeah.
But the actual device, the device doing the snipping must be UL 924
needs to be listed.
But the luminaire itself. However, luminaires such as Dolly, where that signal is not an active presence all the time, has a different behavior state, correct?
Well,
not exactly.
The default for Dolly out of the box is it acts just like a 10-volt. It goes to full if it has power, same as 10-volt. You can configure it, so that's where sometimes it gets fuzzy, but in most cases it's not configured. DMX512 does, up until the new edition, new version, has not doesn't follow that. It's that the manufacturer shall declare this in the documentation. And so what the new revision does is it provides some classification to make that examination easier. There is an article in the spring edition of Protocol from ESTA. So if you go to ESTA.org and find your way to Protocol, you can look at that article. It was written by Milton Davis, who's the co-chair of the Control Protocols Working Group, and I contributed to that. And that discusses the various revisions, including this. There's also an article in that edition by Javid on talking about E1.68. So those are some good resources to look at.
Yeah, we'll make sure that we have a link to that in our.
Yeah, and anyone who's not familiar with Protocol should know that those are free resources. All you have to do is enter your contact information, your email, and you can download those resources.
Yeah, all the ESTA standards are free downloads, and then you can. I don't know if you have to even do your contact to look at Protocol online, but you can. I mean, it's no problem to do that. And as there was also an article coming out of the Lighting Controls Association that was several months ago, which also does a lot of discussion on emergency lighting control. It doesn't talk much at all about DMX512, as I recall, but it's also a good resource for information. And then Javid and I are always happy to talk to people about this. We both get regular calls, and again, more than happy to try to help. But I think the key thing we wanted to make people understand is that UL 924 hasn't actually changed. There's been changes in the code, which also becomes tricky because not the same version is applicable in the same areas. So you have to watch that. And so there's information there. And the new classifications are going to be helpful for when you do that evaluation, or if you're already in the field and you're working with your inspector, and say, hey, look, we got this information here. Let's see what we can work out together.
And Javid,
and for the sake of the listeners, when we're talking about the code, we're talking about the National Electrical Code, which is also known as NFPA 70. National Fire Protection Association is the organization that maintains that standard.
Right.
UL 924 is a standard that is published by Underwriters Laboratories. So just a few clarifications there. UL 924 is a standard for safety. National Electrical Code is the code that is widely adopted through the U.S. for electrical installations.
Yeah, and with the National Electrical Code, you also can go online and view it for free. Again, I think you have to do an email sign up. It's a little bit clumsy, but you can look at it, and there's other tools for that. UL, that you can see the scope, but not much else. But then you've got specific questions. There's your various manufacturers who deal with these products will be able to help you.
Absolutely. No, and by all means, reach out to any of us that are on this call. We're happy to talk with you about this in greater detail. But ultimately, this is a collaborative effort when it comes to this information. I mean, and it is ever evolving. This episode probably, if we watch this 10 years from now, we're going to be like, oh, geez, that's so outdated, and we need to update that. So, as far as things go, I really appreciate having you guys come and reaching out to me and saying, hey, you misspoke. And any listeners, please reach out. We're always happy to talk and find ways to inform people in a better, more effective way. And we don't want misinformation or not necessarily inaccurate, but just misleading information. I mean, yes, I did misspeak and said UL 924 was updated, and it's a shorthand that I use that is really poorly implemented in a podcast format. So
you know what? You're human,
right?
Yep.
So, but again, really appreciate you guys coming on. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about regarding this episode or any of the misinformation?
I'd say just look at those articles and That'll help you sum it up pretty well.
Absolutely.
And from a big picture perspective, what we were trying to do with DMX512 was to bring things into alignment as much as possible, right? You've got 0 to 10, you've got Dolly, you've got DMX512, all of which operate physically very differently. They are
Right.
different signals. And in the case of Dolly and DMX512, they are also very different protocols. But ideally, for the people out in the field, for the electrical contractor who's installing the equipment, we want this stuff to all operate as much as possible
Mhm.
in a similar or the same manner, so that the guy who's putting this together doesn't have to remember that this light is Dolly and this light is DMX and
Yep.
this one is 0 to 10.
Right.
Just
That
let's
would be
let's try to get that harmonization. Yeah.
absolutely, and that would be fantastic when we get to
Yeah.
that point. But at the very
Yeah,
least, let's focus on the life safety components so that
Mhm.
we're making sure people are safe in the environments they're in. And so I totally get the
Exactly.
need to align with that first.
Yeah, and there's all these products. There are listed versions to deal with emergency. That's not an issue, but it's not always, as automatic as you might think. And that's the
Right.
information, part of the information. It's like, just understand what's out there.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, it's really hard for us to preach education ourselves on the show all the time if we don't, right, come back to episodes like this and just fix a couple of things and a couple of
Yeah.
mistakes we made. So yeah, we really appreciate you guys both coming on and taking the time to go back through this with us and re-educate people and make sure that everyone has clear and concise information. And I will just remind everyone too that just as you're working through your projects, make sure you pay attention to which version of the code is being used on that specific project based on when projects started. Things change, so make sure you are paying attention to that, because that is very important as well. And on that note, I think that's a good way to wrap things up for this episode. Javid, Mitch, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. Couldn't have done this without you, and appreciate you coming back on to help clear things up a little bit. Let me just take a minute to remind everyone today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We have all of our episodes, newsfeed, merch store, yada, yada, yada. You've heard me say this all the time before. But check out our Council on Lighting Control Startup and Integration, where we love to have these conversations. Ron and I are always looking to provide more education and resources to this industry. That's why we do these talkbacks. We love getting this feedback. Please let us know and call us on anything that you might think we either misphrase, say incorrectly, or spread as inaccurate information, because we definitely don't want to do that. We want to be accurate. And so that's why we brought Mitch and Javid here today to talk about this, and we really appreciate that. So let us know if we ever have an opportunity to correct ourselves or just expand upon some subjects. We love it. So thank you so much for joining us. And Mitch and Javid, thank you again. This was a great conversation. Appreciate the shorty.